Now, ME-CFS is not an easy illness for healthy people to understand. And when I think back to before I developed ME-CFS, I didn't really understand it either. I found it a bit baffling, couldn't understand what those symptoms would feel like. And so now, when I think about how my friends and family might relate to me as someone who is ill with ME-CFS, I often remember back to my pre-illness self, consider just how difficult it must be for people to get their heads around what this kind of illness feels like. And just also to remember that it's very hard for people to understand what they have not themselves experienced. While it's very understandable friends and family mightn't get ME-CFS, there's a difference between that and those people who actually not only don't get it, but make no effort to get it. Make no effort to actually understand what it is that you are facing. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking more about that kind of dynamic. It truly can be very detrimental to the well-being of the ME-CFS patient. It certainly has been in my case, and it's something that I've personally struggled to know quite how to approach. I'm going to be talking more about that in today's video. But first, my name is Patrick Usher, and I'm author of the book Understanding ME-CFS and Strategies for Healing, in which I talk about the latest, most exciting research into ME-CFS and long COVID, as well as talking about a variety of treatment strategies that I have tried in order to improve my own quality of life as an ME-CFS patient. You can find links for the book down in the description box, as well as the possibility of downloading a sample chapter. Now, when you become chronically ill, it's reasonable to expect that friends and family will approach this new situation in a certain way. That is to say that they will be interested in learning about what you're going through, in how they can support you. And by this I don't mean, doing everything at your beck and call. I don't mean that you're lying in bed and bossing people around. We all have to take responsibility for our lives as much as we can, no matter what our level of health. What I mean is, if you were to have a family member who became ill, you would, I'm really talking about the kind of attitude that you would bring to them, understanding that they're sick, wanting to understand what they're going through and how you can support them in a reasonable manner. And although a friend or family member may not ever put it quite like this, their attitude might embody to some extent the question, what is this like and how can I help? Now, this is all quite a reasonable expectation. A problem shared is a problem halved, and it's normal to not want your life to go invisible to the people to whom you are bound by blood or friendship. But as I said in the introduction, ME-CFS is not easy for healthy people to understand. And the issue of how we can communicate ME-CFS to people without it in ways that they can actually grasp is a big challenge, and perhaps is a topic for another video. But in general, it's hard for them to understand it. The problem I have had and found is that it's when people don't actually make any particular effort to understand what you are going through. It's been my experience that a lot of my family have never asked me, what is it like to have ME-CFS? Have never asked me, what am I actually going through? What does the illness involve? What does it feel like? Have never really shown any interest in the work that I do, in having a look at the books that I've written, for example. And it's just remained something that's kind of met with a lot of silence. And I found that these people, show no curiosity. They've asked me no questions. If I try to talk about what ME-CFS involves, they might shift the conversation very quickly. They might have that kind of glazed look in their eyes. They might look disbelieving. And it's basically not something that they want to go into. I found this kind of dynamic quite hard to navigate. It's actually a lot harder than outright unpleasantness. I've had family members say to me, I think you've got a screw loose. I've had people bedridden come in and say, do you think just lying there is going to help you? Those things are not nice, but they're actually in many ways more straightforward to deal with, because what you see is kind of what you get. Whereas this other dynamic, which is characterized by silence, not engaging, a kind of tacit disbelief in what you're facing, is actually harder, because what it implies is that you have to judge people by their actions. And what it implies, in this case the non-action, is actually that they've made up their mind already. So in their mind, what you're facing is not very serious, probably just tired. And, or maybe they think that actually it is something psychosomatic. And so when you bring evidence that challenges that worldview, when you try and describe your experience, it's not getting past the walls that they've already created, the boxes they've already put you into. And so it's just met with kind of, shifting the conversation or this sort of look of, nothing's getting in. And that's hard to deal with because calling it out will lead to confrontation. And then you have to ask yourself if it's worth it in that particular context. But on the other hand, these are people who are close to you by whatever means. They're not actually willing to engage. And sometimes there is actually a conversation that you have with these people, and it does actually go somewhere. They will say something that actually does indicate quite clearly that they have zero idea of how much you're actually struggling. They'll make assumptions about what they think you must be capable of, which are so far removed from your actual reality that it just suddenly leaves you feeling quite disoriented, that there's such a gap between what your family think you're going through and what you're actually going through. And I found that the most common word these people will use if they ever do come to actually consider your situation is energy, tiredness, or fatigue. And, that's like 5% of ME-CFS. I personally, people will notice in my videos, I don't use those words because it's ludicrous. Like, it is so far removed from what ME-CFS is really about. Chronic fatigue syndrome, I'm going to do a video on that some other time, but it is the worst named term for an illness ever. And even the people who came up with it really regret that they ever did. But, I found that those are the words that these people will use if they do use any. And that's despite, my general strategy, which has been to try and explain in a very polite and non-confrontational way what ME-CFS actually involves. Low blood volume, microclots, autoantibodies, the issues that go on in the muscles, the cells and everything. I'll try and describe these things, which, if you're listening, should make it clear that this is not about being tired. But I have found that hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked despite consistent efforts. And so I'm left thinking, did I take the right approach? Was there anything else I should have done? Should I actually be more direct? Sometimes I've thought of simply saying to people, I'm much more ill than you can actually understand, and that's fine, because I know ME-CFS is difficult to get, but, I really am not well. This video is sponsored by Normalite. Now, I have been using Normalite for 3 years, and it is the most helpful supplement that I have found in managing my own condition. Like a lot of ME-CFS patients, I suffer with low blood volume, and Normalite is a highly effective strategy for combating this issue. It is a form of oral rehydration solution, and one study by Meadow et al. From 2019 found that this kind of formulation can boost blood volume as effectively as a saline IV. When I drink Normalite, I really notice the difference. I can feel the blood volume expanding throughout my body, my legs become lighter, my nervous system calms down. Even better is that Normalite has been specifically created for patients with illnesses like ME-CFS, long COVID and POTS. So check out the link below to order your own bags of Normalite. I personally enjoy the pure flavour, but it does come in a range of options. As I say, I've never managed to really shift the needle with people who come from this kind of general don't want to know sort of perspective. And I feel like these kinds of people, they just had an initial knee-jerk reaction to the news of my diagnosis, and they just kind of stayed there. There's a sort of dynamic that I would call invalidation by default. And one thing I've also noticed about these kinds of people who don't really want to engage, that in their lives in general, they're very, very tied to what doctors will tell them, to what experts will tell them, because they live in a world where they're not necessarily engaging with their own problems in life, because they don't have to. When they have a problem, they go to an expert, the expert tells them the issue, the expert gives them the solution. And they don't understand what it's like to have a problem, to have an illness, where the medical system is not taught about the research into that problem. And so you go to them and you don't get a solution. In fact, you're told perhaps that your problems are actually psychological. And so they can't actually grasp what it means to be left completely alone and have to navigate understanding an illness, all from your own efforts. You have to, as an ME-CFS patient, some of us have good consultants, but in general, and even if you do have a good consultant, you have to read the research yourself. You actually are essentially taking a kind of degree in ME-CFS. And it's really hard for these people to understand that actually in life you may have to do that. And I have found that, when I try to explain what I've been learning, what I've been reading to these kinds of people, again, that blank look comes, and the response is often, well, did a doctor tell you that? Or, why are you looking stuff up on the internet? Like, they cannot actually understand that you have no other choice. And maybe as a patient you will make mistakes because you don't have a medical background, but you have no other choice. Otherwise, you won't get better. So there's no understanding of the nature of the challenge that ME-CFS patients face, and there's no understanding also of the severity. So these two things are tied together. They just assume that it's just feeling a bit tired or a bit off. Maybe there's psychological issues. They hold on to that perspective. Nothing you say can challenge that. You kind of get blamed if you actually look things up yourself because you've no other choice. And so there's a real lack of understanding of the whole nature of the problem. Now, I've had a lot of experiences like this over the course of the 7 years that I've been ill, and some of them have been really, really difficult. And I say that because they involve people that I really loved. And it led to problems because I wasn't able to trust them when I got these kinds of responses over and over. I really, really tried. I reached out to certain family members. Every time I tried to speak, it was shut down within seconds, as a doctor told you that. And I was really ill and I needed support. And instead I was put in a situation where I couldn't turn to anyone. And in the end, because I couldn't talk to these people, a lot of time elapsed. Then I sent a message that I really hoped was reconciliatory, but I got no response to that. And that despite the fact that I'd also had life-threatening symptoms from ME-CFS, and that even of itself didn't lead to any curiosity or desire to understand what I had been facing in the interim. That's a really highlights for me, that particular experience. People who know my story, 5 years ago or 4.5 years ago, I was in hospital with life-threatening situation. It was very serious. I'd been severely ill for 6 months prior. I had to resolve those symptoms myself. In the hospital, they said it was because I was mentally ill. I went on to write a book about that whole experience and why that whole line of thinking. But that whole time when I was in hospital, when it came to a lot of family members, it was never talked about. It was never whenever I tried to share what the diagnosis was, it was met with silence, awkwardness. No one said, "Oh, that can't be right." The seriousness of that situation, it's like I suffered it alone. No one else really wanted to know what was really going on. And they just, again, didn't want to go there. And that, for me, is more painful and more difficult than people who outright are unpleasant. But it's been a real challenge. And that's obviously a more, significant example. But even times where, there was a year and a half that I was coming up from the hospital situation, I'd been severely ill. I made the correct decision that I could not live independently anymore, so I left Ireland. I went to live with my dad in France. Very up and down period. I slowly kind of got stronger. But I was really not able to live anywhere else because I couldn't manage. And of course, what a lot of people without ME-CFS don't understand is that ME-CFS is not about the good or reasonable days. It's about what happens when you do slightly too much, And at that stage, my slightly too much, which could have been walking for 5 minutes continuously, put down me in bed for 2 weeks. So how do you manage life when you're like that? It's very, very difficult. I also had family members who judged me for living with my dad for that time. My family situation is complex. I'm not going to go into all of that. That was reason for them to kind of not trust me because I was there. And then they didn't want very much to do with me. And that was very hard to also understand and navigate. And again, it comes down to the fact of not actually understanding just how severe ME-CFS is, not because it's easy to understand, but because the effort to understand was never made. What are you actually going through? What does this actually feel like? So all of these things are things that, I've experienced. They've been very difficult. Over the years, I've hoped that the general approach I've taken would change things, but It never has. Maybe that's just something I have to accept and say that some people never are going to make that effort. And even if, I've been ill for 7 years, but even if I recover after, 8, 9, 10 years and it's been a long effort, I probably just have to accept that when I tell those people, they'll just say, oh, as if I'm part of a quiz team that came first in a pub quiz. I don't know. Maybe it's just the case that for some people, there's nothing you can do. They will never show that interest. And even if one was more direct about what one's actually going through, it still wouldn't work. And I think that's a painful journey that a lot of ME-CFS patients have to go on, and that they will learn that their friends and family are not who they thought they were. And I think as part of this, it's important to say, you can have very, very good friends who really care about you and your situation with having ME-CFS, and they may not get it, but they do try. They may say things that are mistaken, but they're still trying to understand what you're going through. And so those people, you know who they are because they have a positive regard towards you and you know that they care. And it's very important, even if those people may make a mistake sometimes in what they say, to not make a big deal out of it, because they are actually trying and they do actually care. And as I say, they may never be able to understand it, but that in and of itself is understandable. But there's a big difference between that and this sort of silence, invalidation by default, don't want to know, not interested, has a doctor told you that kind of dynamic just leaves someone who's ill far more isolated, struggling much more alone, which is actually often worse than the lack of medical support. So that's it for this video. Please share your experience of this. Does this idea of kind of invalidation by default, or the sort of quote-unquote silent treatment of what you may have gone through, is that something that you've experienced as well as an ME-CFS patient? Not just these blatantly unpleasant statements that some people can come out with, but a kind of more subtle dynamic where people just really don't want to know, don't care to know what it is you're actually facing. And so it's like a big silent elephant in the room, which is your life, but it actually goes completely undiscussed, unnoticed, and it's rendered invisible. So please talk about your own experience of that, if it's applicable. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this one. Please consider joining my new Patreon Discord community, Treatments and Research community, which has a dedicated Discord server with plenty of channels for focused discussion on sharing of treatment strategies and research to help us move forward as a community, as well as ability to submit questions to myself for Q&A videos and for upcoming guests, and a once a month Zoom call where we can all collaborate on sharing ideas. It only costs €5.50 or $7 a month. Details are down in the description box below. So that's it, and I will see you in the next video.